What is your name?
Stu Rudolph.
What decade would you like to talk about?
I'd like to talk about the 70s.
Why'd you choose this decade?
The 70s were important to me because it was a time when I was turning from a teenager into a young man in my 20s, and I felt very strong about a lot of things in that decade.
How old were you during this decade?
Like I said, I had just turned 20, so there was a span from 20 to 30, and I feel that those are very formative years for a young man especially.
What was your occupation?
Well, out of college, I was looking for work and found a job working for a major airline in New York. And I was a ramp freight engineer, which meant putting bags and freight on airlines, and which brought them across the country. And it was a pretty nice job for a young man. I was able to travel and made some good money at the time.
What was the American economy like during this decade?
Well, I think it was pretty stable at the time. Unemployment, I know, was low, was in like the 3% for the country. Gas prices, believe it or not, were, I think it was 36 cents a gallon for gas. Now, it sounds pretty crazy now, but at the time, that was a good price. But there was an increase back in the early 70s, which had the gas prices jump up to a whopping 50 cents a gallon, and those were creating some turmoil for a lot of people at the time. It affected me personally because the price of jet fuel went up, and it affected the airlines, and they did a major cutback or layoff, and I was put in a position where I had to look for work elsewhere.
What were the major news headlines from this decade?
Major news headlines. Well, the 70s was riddled with turmoil, war. We were again at war in this country, this time in Vietnam, which bled over from the 60s, but in the early 70s, Vietnam War was still happening. There was a lot of political unrest on the campuses and schools, and one of the major news events at the time was a National Guard shooting at Kent State University in Ohio, where four college students were killed protesting the war in Vietnam. That led to a lot of other political unrest, culminating with the resignation of our president, Richard Nixon, resigned, and that was quite controversial at the time.
Which one left the biggest impression on you?
What was the question again? I'm sorry.
Which one left the biggest impression on you? Which news headline?
Oh, news headline, biggest impression in the 70s, I guess, was the end of the Vietnam War. It actually came to an end, a finalization, and the reason it was made such an impression on me is because I did not have to serve. There were opportunities for young men not to be drafted, and I fortunately fell into one of those categories. And so when it was over, I felt a sigh of relief that I was not put in a position to serve in at the time I felt was a very unjust war. But unfortunately, a lot of friends of mine were not so lucky, and they did serve, and some didn't come home, but most did, thank God.
What was your day-to-day life during this decade?
Well, day to day, here again, I was a young man in my 20s, so it was very adventurous, seeking work, and then work, that took up a few hours of the day, but then after that it was, it was a young man time, and so hanging out with friends and going out and experiencing a lot of the culture at the time, which was music and just frivolity, I imagine.
What was the most popular music?
Well, the Beatles were still going very strong in the 70s. Of course, they came to this country in the 60s, but their music was still very popular. But a big jump from Beatles type of music, the disco scene happened. And a lot of disco music came on the scene, and with it, a lot of dance clubs opening up, and disco dance was the rage across the country.
Who were the most popular actors or actresses?
Well, in the 70s, there were all kinds of movies that were trying to be political and political humor and satire. One of the most popular, I imagine, was the Woody Allen. That was his biggest years. Were in the 70s with Annie Hall and. But then again, Star Wars came out in those years, and Harrison Ford, that was the start of his career, and he became very popular. Also, The Godfather was made. Godfathers 1, 2, and 3, I believe, were in the 70s, and Marlon Brando, of course. But Al Pacino was just starting out his career in the 70s.
What historical moment do you remember the most from this decade?
The most historical, I guess, well, probably when the president resigned. Nixon resigned in '70, and that was, and because we felt as young people who were protesting the war and up against kind of the anti-president at the time, we felt that we had won some sort of victory, but of course it was all due to the Watergate scandal, which Nixon put himself into. But we didn't care so much, what the reasons were. But the president resigned. Also, the Beatles broke up in the 70s, and that was pretty devastating to a lot of young people. Let me get that for you.
Who were some important United States world leaders during this decade?
Well, the only world leaders at the time were United States and Russia, and of course it was Nixon and then Gerald Ford who took over for Nixon, and then Leonid Brezhnev from Russia, because we were still having a lot of hard times, and it was a time of Cold War still between the United States and Russia. So those were the major leaders at the time.
What events of today do you think will be in the U.S. history books in the future?
Well, of today, I would include in this decade, of course, 9/11. The wars that we're in now, the fear of terrorism. But I think the major changes and things we'll look back on is the election of perhaps a black president, which would have been unheard of even a decade, 2 decades ago, and perhaps the election of a female president in the near future, which could very well happen. I think those things, those kind of changes in any culture, something so kind of drastic, seemingly, will be remembered for years to come.
Okay, thank you.